Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you to the organizers for the space given this morning to share with you and deliberate on issues that we're discussing in the conference, which is Islam, media and communication. My keynote will delve on a number of themes. First, I would deliberate on the discourse on the Islamization of knowledge, the process, the history, the origins, and why it is important for us to look at knowledge from different perspectives. Second, on the polemic of the Muslim media, how Islamic is the media, the discourse. I won't give solutions, perhaps. I'll be quite ambivalent in some sense, but the discourse that happened over the last 20, 30 years on the need to practice communication and media in Islamic terms. And third is the representation of media, representation of Muslims, Muslim identity in the media. So when you talk about Islam, communication and media, we have to move back to the assumptions of knowledge, how knowledge began. Yesterday I was talking to some of you, even this morning, on how ICIMaC can move forward, how so-called programs and disciplines in ICIMaC can be appropriated, and the role of the university. If you look at the establishment of UIA, Islamic University in Malaysia, and ICIMaC, you'll find that one of their missions is to assume knowledge and science from an Islamic perspective. This task was given to University Islam Antarabangsa in the 80s when it first began. And when it first began, there were discussions on how it would move forward. There was a space given to UIA, and their task was to, quote-unquote, Islamize knowledge. Now, UIA is, or the genre of Islamic universities, among them established in Lahore, Pakistan, and in Kampala, Uganda, was a response to the dominant mode of knowledge production, which is seen to be secular and Western. Knowledge which has been produced and which has been consumed and which has been inculcated in our consciousness have been knowledge of a certain kind, of a certain origin, and is seen to be incompatible with our society, with the Muslim world. Therefore, one of the things that was done was to set up a university which is called, which has the label Islamic, to delve into, to research on things supposedly to be Islamic, to create Islamic social science, Islamic humanities, Islamic sociology, Islamic anthropology, Islamic economics, and so on. And hence, after that, ICIMaC. And when one of the vice chancellors came to ICIMaC, she emphasized on the need to look into Islamic science and to practice Islamic science and to come up with so-called products based on science that was studied in the 9, 10, 1100 AD and so on, within so-called the period of the age, or the golden age of Islam. I do not like to use the word golden age of Islam as if that's the only one, and that's after that Islam faltered. The Muslims all do not have a golden age anymore. So that was the thinking in making the difference with regard to the production of knowledge. Why must Muslims in the world create this assumption? What are the origins of the assumption? How do we see the process of Islamization of knowledge in the world? When did it begin? You may say that knowledge after the time of the Prophet, Muslims deliberate on research, do experiments, debated on life and the cosmos, debated on what it is to be human, look upon the knowledge of the Greeks, and translated works from Greek to Arabic, and interpret and reinterpreted them within the context of the Islamic crucible and the Islamic worldview. Hence, at that time, you have figures like Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, Al-Farabi. The second teacher, the first teacher was Aristotle, the second teacher was Al-Farabi. There was a term in Arabic. So they, among the thousands of scientists and philosophers, flourish in the area which is now Iraq, Iran, the so-called West Asia, and also Central Asia. They created science, physics, mathematics. They interpreted history, so on, also including Ibn Khaldun, and of course the sage Rumi, which is a different plane altogether, and also Ibn Arabi. So that was the knowledge that existed, but it faded for several reasons. But if you go back further, the Muslims were responding to a Eurocentric view of the world. Knowledge which issues forth from a crucible in the 1500 that has dominated our worldview until now. So what happened is that our worldview, our identity, our religion, our self, our culture is seen from a Western perspective, a Western prism. We are, in one sense, white men in a brown mask or in a black mask. We think along the structures of what has been brought forward or what has been created over the last 400 or 500 years. This happened in a sense, or this structure of knowledge happened way back when Christianity was moved from Jerusalem to Rome in the 2nd century AD. And what happened then was knowledge was constructed within the theological, within the administrative aspects of the Catholic domain, hence Roman Catholic. And this Roman Catholic Church dominated the world until the 1500. The collapse of the church, when the church was dominating the world, knowledge was, in a sense, seen to be sacred. But knowledge was also monopolized. There was a kind of authoritarianism whereby no other form of knowledge can be discussed outside the church, and outside the within the church and within the university. If you want to discuss about politics, you want to discuss about the public sphere, you want to discuss about other worldly knowledge, you have to move out of the church and move out of the university. That's why in the universities in Europe, you have this tradition where after lectures, the professors will take the students to pubs and inns, and it's not to drink, but to discuss about worldly matters, to discuss about politics, whereby you cannot discuss about politics in Oxford, in Cambridge, in the classic universities in Europe at that time. This was before the collapse of the Catholic Church, because the Padri was holding or monopolizing knowledge in a sense. But the church collapsed in the 1600s. In fact, was the 1500 with Martin Luther. The collapse of the church created a variety of structures. It, in a sense, liberalized religion. In a sense, it created or shift values of humanity and human beings. Now, what we can see is that the Muslims in the 20th century, 21st century, was responding to three observable phenomena which began to happen in the 1600 and throughout 17, 18, 1900 Europe. First, it was the disenchantment with nature. When the Catholic Church collapsed and you see the rise of Martin Luther and Protestantism, the way in which nature was looked upon was shifted. Nature was not seen as part of man. Nature was not seen as part of the divine. There was the cutting off nature between man and God. So nature was seen to be separate, not having, rather a separate, having a life of its own, and man can control nature as such, not God. Second is the deconsecration of values, whereby values of development, values of science began to dominate, values of superstition and values of the magic and the mystical disappeared. And this led to the thinking in rationality and in logical reasoning. And then you have the desacralization of politics, where politics was seen to be secular, where politics was not related to God, where there was the thinking that there is no higher authority than man, the rejection of any deity, the rejection of any divine authority, the rejection of any sovereignty beyond man. So these three observations have created a certain form of knowledge based on the crucible that it was produced in the 15 and 1600. So Muslims, after some hundreds of years, realized that they cannot live or they cannot appropriate themselves with those forms of knowledge. If you look at the history of Europe, it began with the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. In other words, these forms of knowledge debase man and humanity. And one of these forms of knowledge is social science. Because when we don't talk about Islamization of communication, we have to look into the structure of knowledge of the social science. We cannot go into communication without referring to that corpus that was created in 16 and 1700 Europe. Most of us in Malaysia and in the world go directly to ask questions on how communication can be Islamized or how the media can be Islamized. This is a fallacy, because the media and communication is part of the larger corpus of the social science. And what is the social science? And this has not been actually addressed deliberately even by UIA. And what more, I think USIM may have not gone through this discourse. Because of the mission of the university, it is imperative for each academic body, the larger academic body, and each lecturer would have this consciousness of epistemology. If not, you cannot deliberate, you cannot study your field from an Islamic perspective or whatever perspective that you want it to be. So what happened was that in the 50s and 60s, there was a movement to reform the production of knowledge, essentially in social science and in science. And these were called by various names: alternative knowledge systems, de-Westernization, Islamization, counter-Eurocentrism, Occidentalism, reverse Orientalism, and so on. They originated in the 50s, 60s. Why did they originate in the 50s and 60s? Was because at that time, Muslim countries were in the process of empowering themselves or liberating themselves from colonialism. Hence, there was this also what we call the colonial movement, the anti-colonial movement that decried colonial knowledge, that attempts to decolonize knowledge. And Africa is very strong. Looking at him in Nigeria, Africa is very strong in where Nigeria and South Africa is concerned in terms of the decolonization process of knowledge. So these various ways at debunking conventional knowledge began in that process in the 50s and 60s. And in the 70s, several conferences were held, one of which was a conference on Islam and higher education, held in Mecca in 1977. One of the papers was looking into how knowledge can be de-Westernized. The term used was de-Westernization of knowledge. And this was taken up. As a result, Islamic scholars from all over the world established institutions, and two prominent institutions were established. One was the International Institute of Islamic Thought in Hendon, Virginia, America, which provided the intellectual backing for the International Islamic University. Many of the professors were educated, were trained, were oriented by a triple IT. And triple IT, if you remember, was formed by Ismail Faruqi. Ismail Faruqi was one of the advocates for the Islamization of knowledge. And he devised a 12-step program to Islamize knowledge. And this was adopted by the International Islamic University in Malaysia. And in the 80s especially, if you're around, I think some of you are around, if you remember, that UIA organized a number of seminars. I remember on the Islamization of sociology, Islamization of psychology, of political science, and of social science. And they have adopted the approach by Ismail Faruqi. At the same time, somewhat attached and detached, ambivalent relation with UIA was the establishment of the Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization by Syed Naqib Alatas. It was formed in the 1980s, founded on his book, his classic book published in 1978, Islam and Secularism. In Islam and Secularism, Syed Naqib spelled out the Islamic University, the various faculties, which corresponds to the human faculty of the Islamic University, the Islamic worldview, because when you talk about knowledge, you have got to delve on the worldview, the whole structure of looking at the world. Because knowledge that we accept as knowledge now was issued from a different worldview, a much secular, Eurocentric worldview, where science, where humanities, social science is concerned. Although when you talk about humanities, the early study of the humanities was taken from the Islamic Madrasa, adopted by Cambridge and Oxford. If you go to the Bodleian Library in Oxford, the square, you will see this quadrivium, the study of geometry, language, reasoning. These were taken or adopted by Cambridge and Oxford from the Muslim world, but they have been Christianized, okay? And later secularized. And Oxford is also guilty of many things, one of which is, if we accuse or we know in history that Muslims burn books, or the Muslims burn books, I think the Mongols burn books, maybe some Muslims burn books, but the Europeans also burn books. With the fall of the Catholic Church, books that were reposited in the Oxford Library was burned. I asked them, they refused to answer me. But I found out that they were burned. And they asked me who I am. They thought I'm a spy or whatever. I said, no, I'm just a teacher. And they replaced those books with non-Catholic books, Protestant books. So again, although they may look at a very prestigious university, but they also have this schism in politics and religion. So what happened was that knowledge was secularized and was seen within that particular worldview. So in the 80s, the Muslims responded to it in this form, and they call it, where triple IT is concerned, they call it Islamization. Where Istaq is concerned, under Naqib al-Atas, he call it de-Westernization. In other words, assuming that knowledge is knowledge in one sense, but there are structures of knowledge that needs to be reformed and revised. Why we are saying this is because I assume that all of us are in communication or studying communication, and therefore we got to know the hierarchies of knowledge. We got to know how communication fits into the larger scheme of things. And one of the clearest example of the secularization of knowledge, looking at knowledge in terms of its peculiar origins, which later was made universal, is the corpus of social science. Modern social science. Okay? And modern social science was born in 18th century Europe. The Europe that modern social science was born in was very problematic, was chaotic, was in a state of upheaval. Okay? So that was when social science was developed. And one of the first areas in social science that was developed was physics, or called social physics. The study of society, sociology, was earlier called social physics in the 1800 by Auguste Comte, okay, and Henry Saint-Simon. Why social physics? Is because they derive the study of society from the study of atoms and the movement of atoms. So looking at individuals as atoms, as separate atoms. And this is one of the assumptions of communication and media. If we look at the history of the media and the discourse in the early 1900s, in between the war years and before the First World War, when they were studying the effect of the media with regard to cinema, with regard to radio, they were framing human beings as atoms, as similar to what Auguste Comte called human beings as social physics or society, and study of sociology as social physics. So what they were doing was addressing a local problem, a problem where movements in Europe has displaced men, has displaced values. So sociology was born at that time. And then came anthropology. I'm giving you the basics. Anthropology came because one of which is Europe was in the process of discovering the world. So they went out of Europe and they saw the other. Yesterday we had this paper on self and other. The other would be those so-called exotic, non-European types which they label as natives. So they saw the other and they reflected on the other. So to them the other is a condescending, subhuman species which is not on par with them. And even now, until now, most Europeans, I hold no apology for saying this, look at non-whites as not equal to them. If you read Edward Said, page 5, Orientalism, he said that since the 17th century Enlightenment, Europeans became racist because they see the distinction and division between the whites and the non-whites. They look at us as primitive. They look at other societies as anthropos. Okay? Anthropos, pure men. So this study of the other gave this distinction of the self and the idea of the philosophy of the other. So philosophy and anthropology became the handmaiden for colonialism, and hence it became a form of knowledge and one of the major components of social science. Apart from that, you see the study of economics, one of which was Adam Smith, okay, and then Karl Marx, and Max Weber, who wrote the Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism and Economics and Society. But when Max Weber wrote the Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism, he did not write that as an economist or sociologist. He wrote that as a padre, a secular padre. Okay? And then, apart from that, we have psychology. Freud and Jung, looking into the angst of Western society that has lost its soul, has lost its divinity. And then also they study the science of politics. All these, the study of the major 5 areas of social science, major 5 divisions of social science, were based much on the problems of Europe. In other words, what we receive lock, stock and barrel through the establishment of UKM, USM, University of Malaya and many other universities in Malaysia was the acceptance of lock, stock and barrel of social science into our education system. Without questioning, without developing a critical discourse. Yeah? The corpus based on that disciplines have addressed a very local European problem, which happened between the 1700 and the 1900, particularly in Western Europe, particularly also as a result of the collusion between Jewish communities and the European communities. The idea of ghetto and ghettoizing, the idea of utopia. Okay? Karl Mannheim, for example, he was a Jew, but he wrote about utopia. Marx was a Jew. I'm not criticizing their ethnicity, but I'm talking about the conditions in Europe, the social conditions, the political conditions that created these problems. Hence, these problems emerge and translated into knowledge, very particular, very local, but it has been universalized as what we know now. For example, yesterday I was talking about mentioning the idea of public opinion. Okay? Is there public opinion in our society? I'm not referring to any political condition today. The fact that public opinion is a category in Europe reacting against the feudal system, and public opinion was assumed to be based on a healthy democracy. Hence, Habermas came with the idea of public sphere. In other words, the structure of thought the structure of argument and deliberation that is shared in the public's imagination in Europe. Is there such thing happening in Asian countries or in Malaysia? So in other words, the category of public opinion, which was discoursed and popularized, especially in the 1900s, was very much a European phenomenon. It is not in the Asian phenomenon. It is not even in the modern Asian phenomenon. But we study public opinion in our thesis. Our supervisors supervise, yes, there's public opinion there, you have to apply this, apply the context of development and progress. We take development communication. We assume that there is progress in society. All these were philosophies based on those assumptions of what Europe wants the world to be. So there is a disjuncture and there is an incompatible paradigm. Okay, that's to establish the incompatibility of knowledge production, which is unequal. Knowledge is produced more from the metropolitan West than from the East. Okay? So, if we look at the corpus of social science, where is the factor of religion? As a university, as in UCIM or UIA, I think you ask this question. Where is the factor of religion? Where is the factor of the sacred space in social science? Because social science does not recognize sacred space. Why? Because it was produced during that mood and climate that resists any form of church authority, any form of divine intervention. Therefore, there is no space for the study of religion. So if we look at, if a social scientist in Malaysia wants to study religion, okay, let's take a communication. You want to study religion, you want to study Islam. You cannot negotiate yourself within the corpus of social science. There is no space. Tak ada. Anthropology, sociology is more sacred and secular. And anthropology is one field that assumes that man has no soul. And yet we are studying anthropology in Malaysia. Although it is a reduced field, but we glorify anthropology, but we have to be conscious of what we're glorifying. And we take that man has no soul in our classroom and study anthropology is this and that. Because there is no space in the study of politics, sociology, economics, or political science that refers to the sacred or religion. So where do we go to? Where do Malaysian social scientists or Muslim social science or social scientists who study religion go to? Even normal universities, they will go to the Islamic Studies department. They will go to to study Islamic sociology, for example. Okay? They will fall back to. Again, that's not proper, because we are just reinforcing this Eurocentric, colonized worldview of knowledge. So in the 80s, there were many deliberations, different forms, or some are parallel, some are not compatible, but there are diverse deliberations on the production of knowledge. Then we come to the discourse on communication. Because within that, in the 60s, in the 80s in Malaysia and the 90s, apart from conference on Islam and sociology, Islam and economics, Islam and political science, which needs to be relooked into. Because when you talk about Islam and economics, again, we have not extricated ourselves from the dominant system. The knowledge of Islamic economics or Islamic finance Do you have a faculty on Muamalat there? Or economics faculty in USIM? Okay. Do you study Islamic finance? Okay. The discourse on Islamic finance. Yeah, we go to banks and we choose Islamic banking, or we deliberate on Islamic economics. One of the criticism is that it has not challenged. I mean, you may have it provides an alternative, but it does not challenge the dominant system. It does not challenge the dominant, to use the Immanuel Wallerstein's term, the world system structure. It is still the underdog. It is still taken to be an option, but not a formidable challenge. It is still the discourse on Islamic economics and Islamic finance is still within the context and the ideology of capitalism. So it is, again, not a formidable corpus. If you take communication, for example, there are a number of, number of conferences in the 70s and 80s that deliberate on communication from Islamic perspective. I think UIA, UPM, your professor Yusuf Hussein look into the Quran and would pull out ayat from the Quran and say that, okay, this is example of Islamic communication, whatever verses, whatever terms that refer to human relationship and so on. And I've asked some of these people, what else have you done in the UIA? They said that they have studied media in Muslim countries. But to me, what should be done with regard to communication is to re-examine again the epistemology of communication, where communication comes from. Where is the knowledge of communication? In this faculty, you have communication as a department in support of da'wah and so on. And UIA, you have a department of communication. Does the study of communication descend from heaven? Can it be changed? Can it be reformed? Can it be re-examined and reshuffled, restructured the whole thing? I think we have not done that in Malaysia. We have not been radical, in a positive sense, to radicalize the study of communication. And yet we complain that we are misrepresented. The problem is we do not know how to represent ourselves. In the first place, the study of communication that came to Malaysia, initially through USM, ITM, and then UKM and other universities, were mainly the American paradigm. And the American study of communication, mass communication, only emerged as a post-World War II phenomenon, together with another field which is cybernetics. And from there, communication or mass communication was operationalized as a Cold War strategy. So there was this period of Cold War between 1946 and 1980s, and CIA operatives and manuals were used in terms of generating public opinion, so that favorable countries or countries will be favorable to the policy of the dominant power. And there was this two powers actually, the capitalist West and the Eastern Bloc. This was before 1990. Okay? You got to know this history of the Cold War. So communication was a child of the Cold War. Much of the materials that we study in communication in the comm schools in Malaysia, in other parts of Asia, were operating manuals of the CIA, declassified and becoming textbooks that we studied. Because these countries like Malaysia, for example, and in South Asia, were seen as the bulwark against communism and the domino theory with the fall of Vietnam to Ho Chi Minh, and the Americans move out, and they thought that when Vietnam fall, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia would fall also, the domino theory. But fortunately, that did not happen. I still remember it was, Malaysia is only about 1 or 2 hours from Vietnam, and anything can happen. They just invaded us with their planes. This was in 1976. The picture of the Americans moving out or escaping from Saigon. So, again, the impending picture of Indochina, the Americans thought that it would be good to contribute to the establishment of a free world in South Asia with democracy, and democracy will be perpetuated by the free press, and one of the instruments that can do this was the communication school. And hence they send these Peace Corps volunteers in 1970s and 80s to teach in USM, in ITM, and in UKM. So they were the ones. So there was this geopolitical imperative with regard to so-called academic study of communication. So what we have are those materials which do not arise, which arose from a geopolitical or from political orientations where the dominant power is concerned. And whether we call it communication or mass communication, it is not a discipline. It is a field contributed mainly by sociology, anthropology, psychology, and politics and economics and information theory. And from the information theory that we have, the theory of Shannon was taken from mathematics, and it was used and overused in communication. And before Shannon died, he made a statement: had I known my theory would be used, I would have asked for royalty for his information theory. But again, the study of communication in Malaysia has been around for 40 plus years, but nothing much has changed in terms of what we study, in terms of the worldview, in terms of the structure, and also in terms of, for example, how we link media and communication to an endogenous, indigenous, decolonized form of knowledge. We have not restructured that. So this is another problem with the various forms of looking at communication and media from a different perspective. In line with that, in the 80s and 90s, there arose another polemic, which is, what is a Muslim media? So from the discourse on Islamization of knowledge and the Islamization of communication, we have the discourse on the Muslim media. Would the Muslim media be, at that time there was no social media, there was no internet, we're talking about radio, television, and newspapers. Initially we're looking at Malaysia. Would the Muslim media be like Harakah? Some have questioned. Would it be like Utusan and Berita Harian? In other words, would a Muslim media, can a media be labeled as Islamic if it is operated by Muslims in the country? Or can it be Islamic if it is operated by Malay Muslims? Or can it be labeled as Islamic if it is operated by non-Muslims but having a certain appropriateness in terms of its delivery, in terms of its ethics and contents? So there was this short but valuable polemic. And I think this polemic has left its legacy in what we are deliberating today, or afterwards, or throughout this conference, in terms of the Islamicity of a Muslim media. And there are many questions were asked. Would it refer to contents? Would a Muslim media refer to contents like Al-Hijrah, for example, or Muslim contents? In the 90s, there was also some thought in reference to some documentaries produced in Turkey. Would a Muslim media be programs like National Geographic documentaries? Can a Muslim media be films like Hollywood? So all these things remain unresolved. And in Malaysia, I think we have attempted to formalize such a media channel in the form of perhaps ICIM Radio, Al Hijrah, and maybe TV3 is trying to be, anybody from TV3 here? Trying to announce itself as a popular Islamic channel. And there is this collusion between being popular and being Muslim. And also there is this manifestation of a Muslim reality show. So again, where are we heading to? Like for example, you want to counter Coca-Cola, you have Mecca Cola. You're putting on par on that particular object or artifact that you reject in the first place, but you counter that with a different name. Similarly, we have our criticisms on the reality program, but we have a Imam reality show. So again, it's good for us to discuss and deliberate on this. And then another discourse, which I'm coming to, which is perhaps my final point, is on the representation of Muslims in the media. And this is one of the perennial discussions in many conferences like this. And I've seen, I think you have published a number of books on representation of Islamic identity. Afterwards, I want to have those books. I want to buy those books. Now, since the 70s, Muslims in the world have been complaining of being misrepresented, underrepresented, that the image of Islam has been distorted by the Western media. What have we done about it? Now, before that, I would like to go through the implications of these representations. One of the impact of the Iranian Revolution, 1979, was the sudden consciousness on the portrayal and the image of Islam. Although Islam has been, like yesterday's paper, Islam has been portrayed in text, in visuals, in the narrative over the last 1,000 years since the Renaissance. But in the modern period, Islam has been given a different, the portrayal of Islam and Muslims have been given a different life, a different political scenario as a result of the Iranian Revolution. And the Iranian Revolution, 79, some of you may be around, I think, had actually shifted the news writing paradigm. I've said this a number of times. Last few months, I was in Tehran. I mentioned this to a number of Ayatollah in two places in Tehran, one in Tehran University. I said that your revolution changed the news writing paradigm. And they said, how? They asked me. Okay, before the 70s, if you study news, it's the inverted pyramid, 5 Ws, 1 H. It's a simple kind of narrative. Okay? Assuming to be objective, value-free, neutral, non-ideological, a simple way of narrating through newspapers and through television and radio. That's it. No question, no polemics, nothing. Except for men bites dogs. That was a polemic that makes news. But after 78, I remember this because I studied. At that time I was in university, and at that time we had all this literature, and I was deliberating the movement. I was, and at that time the newspaper Watan, Jalil Ali, he'll be around. He was, I think, part of Watan. He and a few others. Watan was the staple paper in which we got these discourses and polemics about the emerging Islamic movement, which would define the world and define the Malay Muslim identity in Malaysia. So, what it did was, it changed the news narrative, it changed, or rather it disturbed the 5 Ws on one H. In the conventional sense, that W was not actually emphasized. But after the revolution, that W and that H was troublesome, was problematic. And the world suddenly woke up, the Western world, especially in America, and suddenly America thought, oh, there are 2 Muslims, one the Shia and the other is the Sunni. And that was no problem for us. We knew that there are a number of sects, one Shia, the other Sunni. I mean, the present polemic is a political polemic. But at the time, suddenly the world woke up, America woke up, and even the Muslim world woke up. Oh, there is this movement backed with the idea of forming an Islamic state, Wilayat al-Kafir, and a political kind of structure, and the realization of many attempts from the reformist movement, Muhammad Abduh, and this who's the father of Tariq Ramadan? I don't remember. Maududi, yeah, Maududi. So Ayatollah was successful, was the successful person who led a more successful movement than Maududi and the others. And so the news writing paradigm suddenly became ideological, suddenly became not value-free. Because there's a value in terms of, you just cannot write objectively. You have to perhaps have some sort of objective, subjective relation with what we have written, where journalists and media are concerned. And here we're not only writing about secular, day-to-day events. You're writing about a sacred event. In other words, where news is concerned, it is time, novelty, it is timeliness. Those are the staple. But when they report about Islam, when they started to report about Islam, they were starting to report about a movement. They were starting to narrate about a civilization. They were starting to narrate about the plane of timelessness, the plane of the divine. And this restructured the narrative. And if you look at the coverage of after that, early on it was BBC, Le Figaro, Times, and so on, and their coverage was problematic. But later on you will see this kind of narrative where questions were asked and more probings were there. But unfortunately our media does not do anything. We have not taken up. It has changed the dominant news writing paradigm, but it is slow to come to us. So that is the observable problem of representation of Islam in the news and in the media. The second phase, that was the first phase in the modern period. Second phase was after 9/11. What year was that? 2002. 2001. Okay. Yeah, I was at the time lucky. I got home one day earlier. I was in Zurich, and suddenly I saw this. The airport was jam-packed, and there was queues everywhere. There was chaos, and I got on the plane. And then when I came back, I didn't know what's happening. When I opened my door and the TV was on, the plane hitting the Trade Towers. I asked my mother what's wrong. I said, my mother, what's happening? So had I been one day earlier late, I would have been stuck in Zurich for another week. No money, nothing. There was I attended a conference in Budapest, IMCR. So Al-Qaeda 9/11 was another phase of the representation of Islam, and this is linked to terrorism. Although Islam has been linked to terrorism in the coverage of the Palestinians, PLO, but this gave a new dimension to Al-Qaeda and to linking Islam, reinforcing Islam as terrorism. The third phase was with the emergence of ISIS. The intertwining nature of extremism, media, and Islam. So again, it's not the separate. When you look at the Al-Qaeda, you will see the separate technology and the narrative. But in ISIS and extremism, there is a more reinforced value that Islam is an extremist religion. The term Islamism and Islamic State was reinforced. At the same time, ISIS provided a brilliant strategy, actually. They tried to reconstruct the legitimized idea of an Islamic State through the terms IS and Islamic State. And they have used the new media. So this gave an added dimension to, I don't know, the narrative of Islam. They narrate Islam as part of Islam, and this, the representation is part of us too. So yesterday I was talking to the TNC, how do we counter this? One strategy which America knows is to have a counter narrative in various ways. And to counter the narrative, you have got to play with the media that they play. The media that they play is the digital media, the online media. So that's the third phase in the coverage of Islam. The fourth phase, which is not very far from that, was when Donald Trump announced his executive order that he bans some Muslim countries, and he said that this is not about religion. That is the fourth phase. And the fourth phase is happening now, which is a combination of the first, second, and third phases of the representation of Islam. So what do? As Lenin said, after the Russian Revolution, what is to be done? I use that phrase. And what have we done? There are many ways that we can do, but still we are dominated. That's one thing that perhaps in a small way, within our capacity to do, is what I've, this is the third time I'm suggesting it. The first time I was suggesting was, I suggested this in 2008 in a UIA conference in KL on the representation of Islam at the Putra World Trade Center, if you remember. Second time in Tehran in May or March this year, and third time here. In the comm schools, in the journalism schools, we have a number of courses, right? But do we have a course on the reportage of religion or reportage of Islam? We complain that, the West have reported on Islam and they have distorted, they have not done justice to us. We complain, we have produced so many papers on the representation and misrepresentation of Islam. But still our core courses, I'm looking at something doable for us. I mean, we can do this afterwards also. There's no problem. Go to hell with MQA. On courses that educate, that give space to our students and the university student as well, because this is not only for communication, but it's for the university, how we could counter and engage ourselves with such image of the religion. There are two which I have in mind here. One is a course on, say, the representation of Islam. Second, on the reportage of religion. I've checked, no university in the world have this course called the reportage of religion. There may be some exceptions, and when I say no, I mean other exception. I may not know everything, but there could be one or two in America. But I know that there had been one course in India in the 1950s in one university in Kerala on the reportage of religion. I thought that if we could have that course, we develop that course for our students, the reportage of religion, we can introduce a number of literate strategies or number of strategies to either to write, to narrate, or to counter, because news uses a secular language. You're talking about news writing, it's secular language. I mean, they're talking about the present. The present, the past, okay? In past tense. Whether it is a newspaper or documentary or radio or TV or whatever, it's past tense. But religion is what? Past tense, present tense, future tense. Religion is transcendent. So, with regard to that narrative, how can a secular, time-bounded paradigm be compatible with a transcendent, sacred paradigm? So the mechanics, the mechanics in language itself is problematic. When Western reporters cover Islam, they use their language. I'm not talking about English or whatever, but I'm talking about the language of their culture, the language of their thought, also in terms of the time and space. But the language of religion, with regard to time and space, is different from the language of news. So again, we need to study that. I've written this and published it in two journals of the incompatibility between the news writing paradigm and so-called the worldview of religion. So again, we need to make that compatible. And from there, we can see the appropriateness of the presentation. So, thank you very much. I thought that we can make short wins for a long-term purpose. Thank you.